I'm super excited to be talking with Sonia Thalman today. I have known Sonia for several years now, and she's now one of the marriage coaches on our team at Marriage Helper. And so we're going to be diving into several topics today, especially in the line of working on your pies from her perspective as a coach, but also even her perspective as someone who also focuses to work on her pies. So Sonia, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Kimberly.
Absolutely. Well, tell the listeners a little bit more about yourself and what led to your journey to becoming a marriage helper coach.
Awesome. Yes, I would love to share that. And I'm gonna warn you that this is a really long answer. And so, because I want to start how I found Marriage Helper. And so it was back in 2020 during the COVID crisis, and I was laid off of my marketing position. And I had already been working at home for a year, so just really trying to figure out what my next steps were. And I came across Marriage Helper through a job search and had some interviews with Gemma and with Kimberly. And so I initially started with Marriage Helper in a marketing role. And it was then at that point, about a year, when I decided to transition out of that role. Now I'll explain how that came about. And Kimberly, you may remember me sharing this with you when we met for coffee when I was showing interest in becoming a coach. And you did a podcast with Alex Judd. And one of the things that Alex Judd said that he was explaining that somebody else said to him was, how do you define success? And he said that he learned to define success on doing what God has called you to do. And so during that moment, I was really sitting and wrestling and praying about what my calling was. What was I called to do? What is my purpose? And I had just grown into loving the culture of Marriage Helper and the mission, Marriage Helper's mission, and then also thinking about my own situation and how I could further my purpose using my story. And so that's how I came to become a Marriage Helper coach. Now, this is a part two to the answer to this question. There are, in our 3-day workshop, there's breakout sessions. And on the last day of breakouts, there's 2 questions. And those questions are, tell us a time that you did the right thing. And then another question is, what does God want you to do about your marriage? And so over the last several months, I've changed my answer when I'm in breakouts as a breakout leader. And I decided to change my answer because I felt as though well, let me back up. So doing the right thing as far as deciding to save my marriage, deciding to work on my marriage, and deciding to show our kids what a good, healthy, and successful marriage looks like. Now, as far as what God wanted me to do about my marriage, I think that God wanted me to save my marriage, because if you would have told me 5 years ago that I would be sitting here with you talking and speaking as a marriage coach, I would have said, you're crazy. There's no way, because that just was not a vision at all. But I think that God had a plan for me, and I am doing what I was called to do. And I feel very successful in my position to be able to use my story, work for this organization, and help others with their marriage. So there's my long-winded answer.
I love that. Do you think that the stair-step approach, like starting by dipping your toe in the marketing, but then seeing through that process, the vision of how you could use your skill set and what God has called you to do to be a coach, was that what dipped your toe in? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And I remember feeling like, even in my marketing role, like I loved being kind of behind the scenes and, just working on marriages, whether it's like the toolkits or podcasts or, whatever I was, email behind the scenes. But then you're right. It was like that stair step and dipping my toe in and then deciding I want something more, or I want something different. I want to step in front and be customer facing, client facing.
Yeah. What is your favorite part of being a coach?
I love being able to offer hope to people. I love being able to be that person that people need during their time of crisis, for somebody to listen and to guide them. Because a lot of times when people come my way, they are in the middle of crisis and they just need guidance. They need to know, what is the first thing that I do? Just they want to be told, tell me what to do. And although I don't tell them what to do, I coach them through on what to do by asking questions and things like that. But it is just being there for them when they feel like they don't have anyone.
Yeah. What's the hardest part of being a coach?
The hardest thing about being a coach is taking on people's, not necessarily people's problems, but it's very hard for me to, at the end of my day, to just shut it off and move on with my family life, because I'm constantly thinking about them and thinking about, oh, I should send them this resource or this article, because I'm always thinking about it. And so I was just talking to Melody the other day about this, and I have to find ways to shut it off. Because I can find myself zoning out, even if my husband's talking to me and I'm zoning out thinking about someone else or their situation. I do have to figure out how to shut that off and, compartmentalize.
For sure. Yeah, for sure. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about someone's experience coaching. So I would love for you to use an example without, giving away any identifying information. But when you first start talking with someone, and you said just a minute ago, they, their life is in shambles, there's a crisis point, they want to know what to do. And you said, we don't tell them what to do, but we help coach them. Can you explain with an example of what that looks like? How do you coach them through stabilizing, not being so emotionally charged? And then what should they focus on? What does that look like?
Yes. And so I would say that when one person comes to mind as you were asking that question, she was, immediately, without even me kind of introducing myself or saying much at all, just in tears and could barely speak because she was so incredibly distraught in her situation. And so first and foremost, I want to make sure that I'm listening and just allowing them to speak. And then I'll ask questions and try to guide them in a direction of even though it does seem like so incredibly terrible, the situation you're in, I try to see if I can guide them or steer them into some positivity. And what I loved about the specific conversation that I'm thinking of, by the end of the call, like halfway through the call, she finally stopped crying. And then at the end of the call, we were laughing together. And the more that she shared with me, the more I was able to help her find the positives in the situation. And I think that that's really hard for people to see. And so I love being able to point that out because they feel like there's not one positive thing. And I'll say, but you mentioned that your husband called you to say goodnight. Isn't that positive? And then they're like, oh, you're right. Or, you mentioned that your husband stopped by to drop off some food for you. Isn't that positive? And so I love to be able to steer the call in that direction.
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a good point. I was doing some question and answers yesterday, and one person, it's in a similar vein. I can't remember the exact question, but they were saying, I've been doing this. I've been standing for my marriage for 8 months. Nothing is working. Every relationship in my life is better than it's ever been, except for the one with my wife. And I was like, let's reframe this. Like, that's huge. Yeah. That's a huge positive.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So way to go on that work. And it's so true. People need to see some of that hope, some of that positivity, and it helps motivate them to keep going. Where do you utilize personally and as a coach with your clients, the pies as a framework to help people? How do you use it as a framework to help people?
I use it, and we describe it in the workshop and when we talk about the love path and when people fall off the love path, and you always go back to the pies. And so oftentimes there are, and the same example, the woman that I was speaking of, that's kind of also how I steered the call was, what is it that you can work on today? What are the things that you can control right now? And that is you. And so even in this crisis that you feel so lost and alone and broken, what are the things that you can do to start working on yourself? And so that's when I'll work the pies in. And it will, kind of just even go through, let's set some goals. Let's see where you're at now and let's see where you have room for improvement. And then we'll go from there.
Have you seen yet that there's a common thread? And I don't know this is not a leading question because I don't know the answer to this, but have you seen with your clients that there's any kind of common thread of the kind of goals that they're wanting to work on?
I don't know that I would say that there's a common thread. I might have to think about that for a second. That's a really good question. I think there probably is one. We'll need to think about that.
Yeah, I would be interested to see if, and especially, from when someone starts coaching and kind of what their focus is at the start versus after a couple of sessions, if their goals change because they have become more, hopefully a little more emotionally stable. I don't know if you've seen that part of it either.
Well, here's the thing, as I think about that question, it honestly depends on at what point they're coming to me, at what point in their marriage helper journey that they're coming to me. And so if they're coming to me where they found marriage helper through a Google search and they go on the website and they book coaching, they really don't have a foundation of much of anything other than a few videos that they've watched. And so at that point, then I'm taking them on kind of that pies journey. I'll have other clients that come to me post-workshop that already have that foundation and that knowledge. And so they've already been working on themselves and they have a clear understanding of pies.
Makes all of the sense in the world. So as you are encouraging people to, focus on the things they can control, focus on themselves, what does that look like in a coaching relationship? Where are you encouraging them to start? What kinds of things are they doing that they're finding helpful? Different things like that.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And because, I'll first encourage them to go do your best self course or to do the art of attraction, because there they'll be able to get the assessment. And I think that the assessment is so eye-opening and helpful and the perfect way to start working on your pies, because I think a lot of times people get really overwhelmed. I will have some clients that will say, I don't even know where to start. This sounds so overwhelming. All 4 areas, I need to work on them all at one time. And I'll break it down. Let's just think, and I'll actually give them this homework. I want you to think about 2 to 3 areas in physical, and then 2 to 3 areas in intellectual, emotional, and spiritual, and then email them back to me, or we'll talk about it in our next session. That way we can kind of take it from there. Okay, so you want to, start running, or you want to lose 10 pounds. Well, then what does that look like? What are the steps that you're going to take in order to get to that, the macro goal? And we'll talk about the micro goal.
Yeah, that's good. How, as you mentioned, as we as we started the conversation, that one of the areas that can be hard about being a coach is taking on other people's pain and problems as your own, which is a huge sign of empathy and compassion in an individual, but also just on a greater level, like that's a lot of extra weight to carry, right? And so even for our listeners who, they're probably not coaches, but they probably are in different situations in their life where they're carrying the burdens of other people for whatever reason. So how have you worked through that? And I know maybe you're even still working through it, but how did you identify that that's what was happening? And what are some of the conscious choices or decisions that you've made to healthily handle that kind of responsibility?
Yes, that is such a good question. I will say how I identified that is my husband noticing in me, either by my mood or my facial expressions, or just even sharing with him like, oh, that was a really hard call. And, I'm just feeling really sad and really heavy. And so him recognizing it, and then me being aware to say, okay, what are the things that I can do to kind of, it's almost like bringing your work home with you. Even though I am home, I'm bringing it downstairs with me, or in,
Sure.
around me. And so one of the things that has really, really helped me is meditation and a prayer. Oftentimes, I'll just go into prayer and just say, like, God, pray for this, pray for these individuals, pray for these people. And I can't carry the burden. I'm going to give it to you. I'm going to give this to you, God. And so those are the two biggest things. And also journaling. Like, I'll journal about how I feel about something, or sometimes even my journals turn into prayers, because it's just my way of releasing it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. What about as you are working from home, you're a mom, you are, again, in this helping profession, which can have its own heavy weight to it, as we've talked about. You're a wife on top of all of that. So just speaking from that sense, I know that that's where a lot of our listeners fall as well. How have you kept a healthy focus on your marriage? How have you focused to be a present mom? And how have you focused on yourself, working on your own pies as you're juggling all of these things?
Yeah. So, I mean, it is so important for me to, I've done a lot better of not carrying the emotions with me, and, but I have my ups and downs. I think a couple weeks ago, there were so many clients that were reaching out to me, and I felt, whether it was through text or email, and I felt like I have to respond. And I found myself doing this as my husband's trying to have a conversation with me, or as my kids are trying to have a conversation with me, or in the middle of dinner at a restaurant. And I'm recognizing that I need to make sure that I'm prioritizing, and that I'm basically living out what I'm sharing with other people to do, to be present in the moment. And even teaching people, like, your wife wants you to be present and listen to her. And so I have to remind myself of that. My husband and my kids want me to be present and listen. And so it's just balancing it all, and recognizing, you know what, I'm not going to get back to this client right now. I will do it later. Or, just really focusing on the things that are important in that moment. Mm-hmm. And so that's one thing. And then as far as just the balance of the pies, and maybe this will segue into what you and I talked about before the call, but I have really struggled with balancing my pies over the last several, I would just say maybe 60 days, because I had this like really good routine going, and then something gets me out of routine, and I'm like, how do I get back on? And so I've had to reframe and refocus and make sure that I'm prioritizing what's important to me. And just like I share with my clients, if I don't show up for myself, I'm not going to show up for my husband, for my kids, or my clients. Like, I want to be so incredibly present during that time, in that moment that I have with them. And so I have to first and foremost prioritize what's important to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And knowing you just over the past couple of years, I know that you're a person who has put a lot of focus on your pies. Like, you have routines. You and I have talked about it before. You do the pie stacking and the habit stacking, and that's just the kind of person you are. And so I can imagine that, especially for someone who is in such a routine with your pies and was in such habits, that when something has like offset that routine, or even when, like, if you get into a funk, which we can kind of talk about, how did that, well, the first question I want to ask you is when your pie's journey started looking different than what it had looked like. What was the thought process that you had? Like, did you start by having a negative self-talk, like guilting or feeling shame of like, I'm not doing what I used to do? Or do you feel like you handled that season with grace and mercy towards yourself of like, hey, I've been out of my routine, but it's okay? What was your real-time experience with that?
Most recently, I did not handle it with mercy and grace. And so in the beginning of the year, I set off to do 75 hard. And I had planned, and for those of you that don't know what 75 hard is, it's 75 days of 2 45-minute workouts a day. One has to be outside. You drink a gallon of water. You read, I think it's 10 to 15 or 10 pages a day, and then no alcohol and eating, a healthy diet. And so before I started this, I was so intentional about, even when I had decided this around Christmas time, I had written in my journal, okay, here's how I'm going to do this. I'm going to plan this out. I even went as far as planning out my calls during the day to fit in my 2 45-minute workouts, one in the morning and one at night. And so I wasn't taking calls first thing in the morning or late at night because I wanted to make sure I got outside before it got dark. And so I felt like I had made such good efforts in planning this all out. So I got about 30 days in, and I felt like I was doing really well. Even going to the gym with you, Kimberly, at Evolve, I loved it, and I felt like I was getting into a really good rhythm. And then, after 30 days, went to the doctor and just struggling with my hormones, and just one thing right after the other. And so that is what derailed me. And so I definitely did. I got into a funk and I wasn't giving myself grace or mercy. I was really hard on myself. And then I'm like, I'm quitting. I'm done. I'm done doing this, and I'll try again later. And so I'm just now coming out of that, but I'm having to, now that I'm coming out of it, I am giving myself grace because I'm reevaluating. I am not 30 years old anymore. I am not in the same body that I was 15 years ago when I was really fit and working out every single day, 3 times a day, eating the way I did. I'm just in a different period of my life. And so recognizing that I am in a different season, I do have to accept that. And that is what I'm working through. And so I am reevaluating. And even yesterday, pen and paper, I'm going to reevaluate my schedule in the morning, my pies, and I'm doing things differently. And so working it to make sure that it works for me, it works for my family, and that I am able to prioritize in a different way. And you know what? Just accepting of where I'm at and putting a plan in place and moving forward.
I love that. That is the lived experience of what we talk about in the pies when we say for your age and situation in life, right? It's not comparing ourselves to others, and it's not comparing us to our old selves, because as we go into the later stages of our lives, there are things that change and they make such a huge difference. Hormones are such a huge one, right? And so when we can really recalibrate that thinking into thinking more about longevity instead of just like in the moment, either how I feel or how I look or anything like that. I've been doing a lot of listening on longevity recently. So that's why I'm like, it's my new kick. I'm like, it's all about longevity and not getting this, my heart rate super high every single day. Like that's actually worse for longevity. Anyway, all of those things. But that's such a beautiful depiction in your real experience of what it looks like to have grace for yourself for our age and situation in life. And really what is our ultimate goal, to be present with your kids, your husband, to fill up your own tank so that you can give to others. Well, we can figure out all kinds of different ways to work on your pies that help get to those kinds of end goals. So thank you for sharing that, Sonia.
Yeah, of course.
What about for the person who is listening to this and they are in a funk right now where they're like, I don't have the motivation to work on myself. I'm not super happy in my relationships, but I don't really know what to do. What would be some of your encouragement for them?
So I love this question, and my answer is coming from someone else when I heard it in a different podcast. But when you don't know what to do for yourself, do for others. And I think that is so incredibly beautiful. And I think that it will help you gain perspective and be able to even just look inward when you serve other people. So go volunteer, go to your local food pantry, do something to serve somebody else when you don't know how to serve yourself.
I love that too. I wrote it down to include for everyone as a key takeaway from this episode. So when you don't know what to do for yourself, do for others. That's fantastic. Well, Sonia, where can people find more about you? If they want to coach with you, where can they find out that information? Tell us all the things.
Yes. So first and foremost, go to marriagehelper.com, go to coaching, find my bio, and you can book a session with me there. If you are already in the Marriage Helper community and want to learn more about me, I do have an interview that I did with Gemma late last year, and you can find that within the Marriage Helper community. And then aside from that, you can follow me on Instagram at Sonia Thalman. I, just post about marriage stuff and relationships and just taking care of yourself, all things pie. So yeah.
Fantastic. We'll include those links too for everyone so that they can follow all the links to find you and to find your coaching page at Marriage Helper as well. Well, Sonia, it is a joy to know you and to work with you. And I am really for everything you shared today, even about your current struggles, this is what people need to hear. They need to hear that we are real people, and that real people, even the people who do this stuff, can still struggle with it, but we have to get our mind right and really work intentionally to get out of those funks when we have them, not because of shame or guilt, but because we know it's what's going to put us back on the right path and practicing what we preach. And so I appreciate you being vulnerable and transparent about that. And I know that the listeners are going to get encouragement from that as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Kimberly. I really enjoyed this conversation.